Good afternoon. I'm Katherine Jackson, and along with my co-director, Luisa Igloria, I welcome you, or welcome you back as the case may be, to the 43rd Annual ODU Literary Festival. If you're joining us for the first time today, our festival theme is Grit and Grace. We hear a lot these days about sustainability and resilience, and those are the notions that were the seeds for this year's theme. I'd like to begin by thanking Virginia Poet Laureate and my festival co-director, Luisa Igloria, who embodies the ideas of grit and grace. Her timeless efforts to make the festival a success have been really extraordinary. So thank you, Luisa. Before we begin, I'd also like to make special mention of the Edie and Forrest P. White Endowment, whose generosity has made it possible for us to feature Mutsuki Mockett in today's program. Other sponsors include the Norfolk Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Muse Writers Center, the Gay Cultural Studies program at ODU, and the Department of Women's Studies at ODU. I also would like to mention that the ODU Village Bookstore has made available a selection of books written by writers in the festival. You can purchase them online by going to odu.edu/litfest and clicking on the electronic bookshelf, or by visiting the bookstore. At the end of the reading, we'll have a few minutes for questions. If you would, please type your question into the Q&A box, and we'll ask as many of them as we have time to do. All right, so here to introduce our reader is novelist Kent Wascomb, who teaches on the faculty of the MFA Creative Writing program at ODU. Kent, if you would, please turn on your microphone and camera.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Luisa, and to everybody in the Office of Community Engagement at ODU for hosting this event. And thank you all out there for being a part of this, our 43rd Annual Old Dominion University Literary Festival. It's my honor to introduce Mutsuki Mockett, and I'm going to be as brief as possible in order to get to the best part of this event. But Mutsuki Mockett, who we are so fortunate to have with us today, is the author of many essays which have appeared in the likes of the Paris Review, Plowshares, Elle, the San Francisco Chronicle, etc., and of 3 books: a novel, Picking Bones from Ash, from Graywolf in 2009, and 2 works of nonfiction: Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye, from Norton in 2015, and this year's American Harvest, God, Country, and Farming in the Heartland. Whether in fiction or nonfiction, writing about Japan or the interior of America, about questions of grief and belief, or a journey tracing the sources of the food we eat, Mutsuki Mockett's work abounds with careful, observed detail and an abiding compassion for its subjects. It is my absolute and utter honor to welcome her here today. Marie, if you could please turn on your camera and microphone. Welcome to the festival.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Kent. That was a lovely and generous introduction. And thank you to Luisa and to everyone for welcoming me to the festival today. I'm excited to talk to you about American Harvest. I have a presentation that I'm going to show with some photos that were taken on the road, so I can introduce you to the subject of the book and some of the characters, and then I'll do a little reading, I think, and then we'll have a conversation. So I'm going to start with my slides. There we go. So American Harvest is a book that I published in April, and it's the culmination of some questions that I had about farming. I'll explain a little bit about why someone like me wrote a book about farming in the Heartland. This is a picture, I think, taken in Nebraska by a friend of mine who's a photographer. and you can see two of what we call combines, or sometimes people call them combine harvesters, racing across the prairie, cutting wheat on a day when the wheat is ripe and the weather is good. And I grew up as a child going to Nebraska and Colorado with my family to see the wheat harvest. And, you know, it was a completely normal thing for me to do, even though I grew up in California. And there came a point where I realized that my friends who mostly live in New York City and San Francisco had absolutely no idea what this was or what I was doing. And I realized that there are a lot of people in the United States who don't know anything about this world. And I realized also that there was a lot that I did not know. So, you know, I think it's a good idea for those of us who work in nonfiction to try to shine a light on areas of the world where people's stories aren't necessarily revealed, or where we think we know what the reality of a situation is. And so I started working on this book about farming. So, but I'm going to start here. Why is this not advancing? There we go. This is my personal, I'll give you my personal history, why I have a book about farming. This is my great-grandfather, Percy, his own father was English, and Percy was born in Spain, but emigrated to the United States on the turn of the 20th century. And to make a long story short, he ended up as the Union Pacific Railway doctor. The Union Pacific Railway extends across the western United States, and one of the prairie towns that the railway went through was a town called Kimball, Nebraska, which is in the panhandle of the state. And when I was growing up, I'd hear just a couple stories about Percy. I would hear things like, if there's a flash flood, get out of the way of the flood, because once Percy was driving his horse and buggy and a flood came and he had to jump out of the buggy and abandon it. So I don't think that's what's going on here. I think he's just fording a creek, but that's one of the stories I heard about him. And the other story that I heard was that he was heroic during the 1918 flu pandemic, and I never really understood what that meant until now. But apparently he hired people to drive his horse and buggy, and he would go from farmhouse to farmhouse. And as the person drove and they traveled from homestead to homestead, he would sleep, and then he would wake up and treat somebody, and then get back in the buggy and go to sleep. And he did this for 3 weeks, apparently. So that's my great-grandfather, Percy, who was English originally. And during, I think, the 20s and into the Depression, when he would treat people and they couldn't pay him in cash, they would sometimes pay him in farmland. And he himself also bought some farmland. And so this is the Mockett side of the family. The farm began to grow in this way. And then my other great-grandfather is named Miles. And this is my great-grandfather, Miles, who was the town dentist. And his family had been in the United States longer than Percy. We're not entirely sure when Miles came to the United States. We think it's sometime in the 18th century. He spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, and nobody knew exactly what that meant, but I think, you know, he could have been some kind of Mennonite or some Anabaptist faith. His family, he wrote, had settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and then moved over to Illinois. And then at some point he became the town dentist in Kimball, Nebraska. He was given a homestead by the U.S. government, kind of at the very end of the government granting homesteads. And he settled in Nebraska. This is his wife, Mildred, who also, I've only recently learned her story. She apparently was an orphan who was hired as a lady's handmaid and then abandoned in the middle of nowhere, and somehow met my great-grandfather and they got married. But my great-grandfather, Miles, too, would treat patients and was sometimes paid in land. And so the family, on the Markley side, this is my father's mother's family, also began to put together a rather large wheat farm. And so here they are, my great-grandparents, inspecting their wheat crop. It doesn't really look all that different today. And the wheat would ripen, and then it would need to be cut. And the town that my father grew up in Nebraska, my dad was actually born in California and then moved to Nebraska at 7. And this is a photo that would have been taken, I don't know, it looks like the 50s. This was what the town used to look like. And I love this picture. It says, you know, Kimball, the Western Gateway to Nebraska, Missile Center, USA, because as you read the book, you'll learn that there are a couple hundred US Minimum missiles, which are planted in the ground here and there around the farmland. And the town was really quite prosperous for a while. And so here they are celebrating their, I think this is either Pioneer Days, or I think this is Farm Days, actually, looking at the farm equipment. And here's another float of the town and its parade and what it would have looked like when my dad was growing up. Well, so my father grew up in Nebraska and then went to Vienna, Austria to study music. And then he met my mother, who was from Japan. And they came to the United States in 1967. I think this is December of 1967. My mother spoke no English. She was from Japan. She brought her kimono with her. It's the one thing she managed to get out of the house when her parents were mad that she was running off with my father. This is her first Christmas ever in the prairie. And the story that I was often told was that somebody in the town dressed up as Santa Claus and came to the door and knocked on the door, and she, you know, was shocked and thought Santa is real. But they were married in 1968, and this is the Christmas before that. And, you know, there was a lot to adjust to, but my mom had really tremendous spirit. She really enjoyed traveling, enjoyed new places, and she, you know, threw herself into becoming familiar with the Great Plains and with Nebraska. And she's a very big influence on me and the attention that she taught me to pay to landscape and to nature and to birds. Anyway, here we are having a picnic. I actually remember this. One harvest, we probably drove all the way from California to Nebraska and went through the wheat harvest, and then at the end had a celebratory hamburger cooked out on the prairie. And there are other pictures in this set which show my American grandmother cooking hamburger over an open flame. So that's a little bit about the history of why I know anything about farming. This is a photo from the 60s. This is my grandfather now. So he would be the second generation to own this farm, which has now been put together when my grandparents got married. And a central piece of equipment that's almost like a character in American Harvest is this. We call it a combine. I hear people who don't farm call it a combine harvester. There are probably some people in the audience who know something about farming, so you know what this is. But for people who don't, the combine harvester was an amazing piece of equipment because it combined different parts of the harvesting process that used to be done separately. So that thing in the front that looks like a wheel folds the heads of wheat back into these knives which sever the head of wheat off of the stalk, and then send those cut heads into the back of the combine, which then threshes it, so separating the wheat from the chaff, and then puts all the grain in a bin in the back. And there's the arm kind of swinging out to the side here, which I describe in the book as being like a giraffe, because that's what I thought it was as a child. And it uses an Archimedean screw to whirl the wheat out of the back of the combine and into a wheat truck, and then the truck can take the wheat to wherever it needs to go. So this is an extraordinary piece of machinery. And it was a revolution in the technology of farming because it meant that farmers could cut wheat more quickly and with one machine. And the weather is very changeable. On the Great Plains, you have storms that can suddenly come in, and hail can come and damage a crop very quickly. So when wheat is ripe, it's really important to be able to get the grain out of the field as quickly as possible. So this is what a combine harvester looked like when I was a child, a little bit before, but they hadn't changed all that much. And this is the combine that one of the combines that we used in 2017 when I went on the road with the harvest crew. And really the biggest difference is that the machine is just so much bigger. And you can particularly see the difference in the header at the front, the thing that goes through the wheat field and folds the wheat back. So here it is, it's a lot shorter. And this one's much wider, which means that more grain can be cut more quickly. And these machines have really become more and more efficient. And this is one of the members of the crew in the book. His name is Michael, and I don't know what he's doing. He's parked his combine and is running maybe to get something to eat for dinner before he continues on his way. And then you can also see how much larger the capacity is to hold grain. So this is one of the 4 combines that appears in American Harvest. Our main characters, this is Eric. Eric is the person who really made this entire book possible. Eric has cut my family's wheat for 30 years. Eric also has gone on to buy some of the farmland when my uncle decided he didn't want to keep farming. So you can read in the book, there's a part where I explain that Eric now owns a good portion of the land. He is from Pennsylvania, and he has been cutting wheat for 30 years. He also has a farm in Pennsylvania. And he's really the one who said to me, if you want to understand farming, if you want to understand farmers, you need to come on the road. And we continue to have a lot of conversations. He's the one who's really revealed to me a lot of his world and his reality. And you can feel his presence in the book all the way through. And so Eric is one of the main characters, and Justin here, who's on the left, is the other main character. Justin is Eric's son. And in this book, Justin is 23 years old, and you can see he has a pair of pliers on his hip, as almost all the farmers do. Justin is a little bit different from the rest of the crew in that he went to a 4-year college. He's actually now in the process of getting a master's degree. And he also took a lot of time to explain to me what I was seeing, because he knew that I didn't necessarily understand what was happening around me, because I did not grow up in an agricultural family. Justin also, as everybody is on this crew, is a Christian. And Justin at one point wanted to become a pastor, but he had a kind of crisis, and he talks about that in the book. And it was very important to him to maintain his connection to God, but he wanted to find a way to do this in a way that was authentic. So we have a lot of theological conversations in the book. You know, some people like that, some people don't. I was genuinely curious as to what his experience was. And I'm really grateful to Justin, because there are situations that I was in churches where I could, because I don't go to church regularly, I didn't understand what was happening. And he was always able to kind of be like a tour guide and explain it to me. So both Eric and Justin really make this story possible, and they're very genuinely warm-hearted, open-hearted people. And so I tried really hard to capture that in the story. So every May, here's what happens. This is a photo. It's a little blurry. I'm sorry. It's the best I could do. One of the guys on the crew took this with the drone. Every summer, Eric in Pennsylvania has his crew of young men he's interviewed and hired, and he gets his semi-trucks together and packs up his equipment on the back in different configurations. So here we see a couple of those combines on the back of the semi-trucks, and those semi-trucks will then be converted, some of them will be converted to grain trucks, and they'll haul the grain out of the field. So everything has multi-purposes. Everything is super functional. There's just so little waste. People use their resources very, very carefully. It's really admirable. So Eric packs all of this up. He hires his crew, and then they hit the road, and they drive from Pennsylvania all the way to Oklahoma, and then down to Texas, which is where the American wheat harvest starts. And this is a map that I worked on with a designer, and it shows you some of the basic information in the book. So the journey that we take corresponds to that blue dotted line. We begin in a town called Crowell, Texas, and then travel on up north into Oklahoma, and then into Kansas, Colorado, and then Nebraska, which is where my family's farm is. And then we travel west in a huge drive in a day through Wyoming all the way to Idaho. And then there's quite a bit of time spent in Idaho. And as you can see, the harvesting route that we took intersects with a couple of historical routes that I've included here. The green line shows some of the cattle trails. Some people may have an idea of what the cattle trail is from Lonesome Dove. In fact, when I was in Texas, everybody said, "Have you read Lonesome Dove?" So that we're sort of in that territory. We can see we passed really near one of the large Native American reservations that's in Oklahoma. That's the first time we meet any Native Americans is in Oklahoma. And then when we turn west, we go parallel to the Union Pacific Railroad. And then in Idaho, we really very closely follow the Oregon Trail route. And so that meant that as we were traveling along these historical routes, I began incorporating pieces of history, of US history, into the narrative, because I kept wondering, what am I seeing, and what was here before? So you could see that the Harvest Trail route really intersects closely with some really key moments in what we call the settlement of the Great Plains. And then the other thing I wanted to point out here was that the harvest route follows the wheat as it ripens. And generally, I was told that wheat ripened at 20 miles a day. So as soon as it starts, harvest begins in Texas. You can sort of predict when it's going to be ripe in Oklahoma. And so as we're cutting fields in Texas, Eric is on the phone with the next farmer saying, how's the wheat looking? And sometimes he would even drive to go look at the wheat and come back and try to plot his moves along the way to make sure that he could get all of the wheat harvested. And the route also makes us think a lot about the natural resources I think that the land has. The wheat in Idaho, for example, is much more dense. It's a lot thicker, and that's because most of those fields that we cut there are irrigated. There's a heavy a water supply, an aquifer under the land, which makes it possible to irrigate the farms, and so the crops respond and they produce a lot more grain. Most of the fields that we cut on this map are dry land, meaning that they receive moisture only from whatever falls from rain, and it isn't irrigated. So I'd never done anything like this before, and I was on the road with these harvesters for 5-6 months, and we lived in trailers like this. My son has never stopped asking me to please get a trailer, and with COVID, I actually find myself thinking that I might. But anyway, we lived in a trailer like this, and we'd hang out our laundry to dry. Every Sunday we went to church, which is not something I had done. And there are a number of different church-going experiences in the book. I learned a lot about so many different denominations of faith in America. And the guys are, I think, really extraordinary people. Most of them have not been to college. Some of them have only completed 8th grade, but the guys who Eric takes on the road have to be comfortable with heavy equipment, and they also have to know how to fix equipment. So this is just a picture. We're in a field in Texas and something has broken, and 3 of the guys in the book, this is Michael in the front, Samuel in the middle, and then Justin, Eric's son, in the red shirt, and they're fixing something that has broken, because very often, we're 50 miles from town and we can't call somebody in, like a mechanic, to come and fix the equipment. The first thing the guys always try to do is to fix it themselves. And my dad was very much that kind of person, didn't hire anybody to come and fix anything in the house. So these guys grow up with a set of skills and just the ability to look at something that was broken and visualize how to fix it that I admired, and I try to put that in the book because I think it's an important part of the character of the people. Along the way, we did go to church, as I said. We also went through some extraordinary storms. This is a picture of a piece of hail. We had a really severe hailstorm in Texas. So if you can just imagine a huge storm of hail that size, a ton of it raining down and totally decimating crops, cracking windshields, etc. I mean, I thought it was, exciting and interesting, but it was also highly destructive. That's the kind of unexpected event that happens on the road. They taught me to shoot. We had, in Texas, we were always dealing with a huge population of wild pigs. So this is, some of the guys are, are very into guns. Some are not, but that's a piece of the experience and the culture of the people. We ate our meals together in trailers, and that's Emily in the back, Eric's wife, who 6 days a week cooks all these meals for us to eat. And this is a day when we're eating inside the trailer, but very often she packs up the food and puts it in the back of a Suburban and drives out to the field, feeds everybody on the field, and then they get back in the combines and keep cutting because you want to get the grain out of the field before hail that size destroys the crop. We had a lot of conversations about God and science, and at the end of American Harvest, by the time the crew and I are in Idaho, you might recall in 2017 there was a total eclipse that passed across the United States, and it just so happened that in Hamer, Idaho, where we were cutting wheat, we were in the path of totality. So we had a moment here where everybody stopped cutting wheat for a little while to look up at the eclipse. And that kind of amplified some of our conversations about God and science. But it was an extraordinary experience to share with the crew. People ask me, what did I want to accomplish with American Harvest? I would say I really did want people to understand how beautiful the United States is. This is just some random sunset. We're so exposed to the hugeness and the vastness of nature on the road. So we saw a lot of gorgeous sunsets. And this is just a picture I took. This is actually in Nebraska, very near the bins that my family owns and the Quonset hut that we kind of live in during the summer. And I just snapped this picture. And I did also include some theology. I learned a lot about Christianity. And this is just an example of the kind of imagery that I would run into in the church where, people would try to take the Bible and condense it into a story. And very generally, I came to sort of understand the story of the Bible as starting with the tree of life and the Garden of Eden, and then moving on to the book of Revelation and the city and the Revelation. And so the book kind of has that movement, starting from a place where things feel very innocent, and then moving into a place in the city where we encounter people who are very different than we are. This is a mural that is in one of the buildings where Justin did volunteer work in urban ministry, and I came to see what is meant by the city as very different as a result of this experience, the city in contrast to rural life. And so the book kind of has that movement from a place of kind of innocence and everybody being open to each other, and then to a lot of conflict, and then moving into the city where we will hopefully learn to deal with others. And so that is some of what went into the making of American Harvest. And I'll just leave this map up for a second. And I'll read to you a little bit, and then I think that we'll take some questions. Here we go. All right. I'm just going to read the start of chapter 2. And then I'll look forward to having a conversation with you. Eric's annual route always starts in Texas because that is where American wheat first ripens. The crew will follow the wheat belt north as it continues to mature. The wheat ripens at a rate of about 20 miles a day. Over the years, Eric has built up relationships with farmers who own land in each of the 7 states, and they all work on the assumption that he is coming to cut their crops. Each year, the arrangements are made on a handshake. There are no paper contracts. For harvest this year, Eric is traveling with Emily and Justin. His older son, Winston, usually accompanies him too, but his wife is expecting a new child, and he will stay home in Pennsylvania with her. 2 other family members are with the harvest crew, Bradford and Bethany, who are brother and sister, are Eric's nephew and niece. Bradford is 21 and Bethany will turn 20 while on the road. The others are young men from the community back home. Competition to get into Eric's crew is fierce, and most of these boys will have called a year in advance for an interview and a chance to participate. Rain or shine, they will be paid a flat fee and will be fed, housed, and given a chance to see the United States. This year, there is Luther, the oldest at 25, Michael, who is 22, Samuel, who is also 22, and Amos, who is 23. This is the first year that a woman has been part of the crew. Bethany and I will share a trailer that Eric has purchased. A few days before I arrive, Eric drove 1,400 miles with his crew from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to Hydro, Oklahoma, where a friend and fellow harvester, Dwayne, lives. The combines and tractors were all ferried on the backs of flatbeds hauled by semi-trucks. Eric dissuaded me from making this drive and asked me instead to fly to the Will Rogers World Airport in Oklahoma City, where I pick up a rental car, a small SUV that still feels larger than anything I'm used to. I drive through a heavy rainstorm, and after it passes, I see a rainbow in my rear view mirror. Eric has given me directions. I thought that when I asked for a landmark, he would direct me to something like a McDonald's in town, but he does not choose a place whose logo juts obtrusively out of the land. His instructions imply a faith in my powers of observation. He's told me to look for a bridge where there's work being done, and that once I see the bridge, I will see 2 combines. Along the way, I pass signs for Halliburton, Hobby Lobby, and Trump Pence, and then I turn off the interstate, and there is the bridge with yellow tape, and there are the combines set up on trailers attached to 2 semi-trucks. The rigs are parked on a farmer's gravel lot by an unused barn. The rain has now completely passed, and the combines gleam in the sun, a glossy, confident red against the green and gold landscape. Each combine costs anywhere from about $250,000 to $350,000. With its hydraulic lift and changeable header, a combine is about as close to a transformer as you will find in the real world. Each one weighs nearly 30,000 pounds, which means it must be carefully placed on the back of a semi-truck to be hauled across the country. All the different pieces of harvesting equipment are a bit like pieces of a puzzle, with space at a premium. To accommodate 3 combines, 4 headers, a tractor, 3 grain hoppers, and a grain cart, all of which must be loaded onto 4 semi-trucks, Eric has devised different ways to transport each configuration. One truck has a combine and a hopper behind it, and another has a combine with a hopper and 2 headers fitted inside. The header is the knife of the combine and the part that cuts the wheat. This particular hauling method requires that the combine face forward, and when I arrive, Justin is wrapping the front windshield with a thick plastic sheet for protection. "One rock," Eric says, and that glass shatters into a million pieces, and it's miserable cutting without a windshield. It is decided that Justin will drive me into the camp where the trailer houses are. This will happen a lot over the course of the spring and summer. The men will do the driving. There are practical reasons for how and why this happens. I often do not know where I am going, and the men do. Justin also jokes to me that I am about 8 years old in farm years. The age is not chosen arbitrarily. 10 is about when kids start to drive tractors, and I cannot truly drive a tractor. Justin chats happily. "It's been a while since I've driven a passenger car," he says. "It feels so small." There is something about the way he confidently zips along these country roads that makes me feel as though, in his capable hands, the SUV has shrunk to the size of a roller coaster car. Justin attends a Christian university in Pennsylvania, where he is majoring in English. He is tall, good-looking, and a little bit brooding, with a fuzzy beard, mustache, and blonde hair of an indeterminate texture and length because he keeps it hidden under a Wheeler Brothers grain cap at almost all times. Justin's smiles are slow to form and always feel genuine because they are so hard won. He has an inward quality, and by his own admission, needs time to himself to recharge after being out in the world. There is a hole in his ear where he wears an earring when he isn't on harvest, and we occasionally joke that his true identity is as a hipster. But this is merely a joke, because he is no hipster. He's the son of a farmer who never went to college, which makes Justin a bridge between worlds. He likes language and the analysis of ideas in a way I find comforting and familiar, while his fellow farmers often tease him about his college talk. Now we are driving onto Dwayne's property. A bonfire is burning slabs of wood and tree branches. "That's how we get rid of trash in the country," Justin says. There are some men, boys really, working on a truck in the lot, and they stare as we park. They are slim and fit, and they all wear jeans and boots. They are a version of the boys I have seen year after year in Nebraska who come to cut our wheat. All are white, and they avert their gazes. Farm boys are shy. Justin has explained to them that I am a writer. "I hope you don't mind," he says, chuckling. "I told them you were from San Francisco," and one of them asked, "You mean like she's a Democrat?" I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Marie. That was a fascinating and more intimate look at all the rich stories that went into your wonderful book. I'm Luisa Gloria, everyone, and thank you again for being here. I also wanted to let you know that Marie will be working in one-on-one tutorials with our MFA Creative Writing students as the Edie and Forrest P. White visiting writer in virtual residence this fall. So now there is time to take some questions from the audience, and I believe Catherine and I will be alternating reading the questions that come in. So I have one from Renetta, and she asks, can you please talk about your writing process, specifically going from field notes to scene creation and dialogue recreation?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I never intended to write nonfiction. I thought I was going to just write fiction and write stories, and I've really gone a long way from what I thought my career would be, and also what I thought writing was. Because I didn't start with an MFA. I only just got my MFA, and so my education on what it is to be a writer has been, excuse me, a little bit haphazard. And I learned a lot in writing the second book, which is Where the Dead Pause, which is this one, which was set in Japan. And I am going to answer your question, but I need to give it some context. And the reason I wrote that book was because I wrote a novel, and then there was a tsunami in Japan in 2011, and I had friends saying to me, "You need to write an op-ed." And I thought that they were crazy, but I wrote an op-ed, and to make a very long story short, it got published in the New York Times, and it changed the trajectory of my writing life. And the next thing I knew, I had a book proposal, and I was supposed to write a book about Japan that was nonfiction, and I didn't know how to do that. I won a grant from the NEA, and I lived in Japan, and I was confronted with your question, which was, how to take field notes. And by the end of that book, I learned, and I kind of here and there would read interviews with authors to try to figure out how they did this. But by the end, I learned that it was really important when I had an experience to try to take notes immediately, and to try to put those notes in scene. And because I had written a lot of fiction, and this is where fiction is really handy, and this is why I think there are a lot of prose writers right now who do fiction and nonfiction. Because I had done so much fiction, I was already accustomed to putting a scene in scene and describing it the way that a fiction writer does. And if you do write nonfiction, I think it's very helpful to read novels and to study them and to see how those writers craft a scene. And so by the end of Where the Dead Pause, writing that book became easier because I was taking better notes. And I was, even though I was absolutely exhausted by the end of the day, I would force myself, if I had handwritten notes, to transcribe from handwritten notes to computer. So with American Harvest, I told myself I was going to religiously transfer notes. So I have here these 3 notebooks. This is where I took the notes while I was on the road. Sometimes the notes are, me taking notes while someone's talking and only I can read my handwriting. And after I was done with a conversation, I would run back to the trailer and put it into scene. Sometimes there's a scene in a rather long scene in the book where I'm mistaken for Native American, and I go to the Sundance, which is a really embarrassing situation, and I don't come off looking very good. I had a second where I thought, okay, let's just pretend that didn't happen. And then I thought, no, it happened. I can't pretend like something didn't happen. And I immediately wrote it down on the computer, just notes and scene, really rough and really raw, so that I could then go back and convert them later. I have a pretty good ear for dialogue, so I'm generally able to write down a key phrase and remember a conversation that's important. I recorded some conversations, but I found in general that was more intrusive than taking notes by hand. So a combination of all of those things, I left the summer with 250 pages of notes on my laptop. When you immerse yourself in a different world, and you're really paying attention to it, it's very draining, and so it can be exhausting. And at the end of the day, all you want to do is go to sleep. And I definitely had that happen to me. But like I said, I knew from the previous book that it was really important to put the notes, even if they were rough, in the computer, and that would make creating the manuscript easier.
Thank you so much, Marie, for that look into your process and that helpful advice to writers who are in the audience. I've got a question here from Nia, and I'm actually going to combine 2 questions that she has. What is the thing you enjoy the most about farming, and what is your craziest experience related to farming?
I mean, I think I really love the people. I think the people are constantly surprising. They think in ways that are very different than I do, and so I'm always learning something. I'm always astonished at how they fix things, and their ability to read the land and read the sky. So it's just I think the chance to learn something different about the world and to be open to something completely new is the thing I value. I also just, the farmers who I was traveling with were so practical and not wasteful and calm. I almost never saw anybody lose their temper. My father was that way too, very, very calm, because they're dealing with equipment that can kill them. And so they're, they're very calm and patient, and also incredibly cooperative. There was an article that went around that people forwarded to me about some farmer who was sick, and so all of his neighbors got together and harvested the wheat for him, and people thought that was extraordinary. But I mean, that doesn't surprise me, knowing what I know about farmers. So being exposed to this different world is something that I really value. And the craziest experience would just probably honestly be having gone on the road with the harvesters. Every day introduced me to something new and challenged my thinking, which is generally something that I enjoy and appreciate.
All right. We have a question from Angela, who observes that there was a person of color in one of the photos you showed us, and she wants to know, who was he?
So he is one of a pair of brothers in the town in Texas who operates the grain elevator. And he and his brother also, I think, farm hogs, I think is what he told me. And there was a bit about him in an earlier draft, and then it got it ended up getting excised because a lot of stuff got cut. But so that's who he is. There are we ran into very few people of color on the road unless they were Native Americans. We did, and then in the cities, I would go get my nails done in Vietnamese nail salons. But I never got the story of how his family came to Texas. And there was a church that was a Black church, I think in Vernon, Texas, and Justin and I would talk about going, and we never went. It was early on in the trip, and I remember feeling like, would I be going and treating people as, like, would I be a spectator? I was a little more worried about that at the start of the trip. But it's also one of the best pictures I have of Justin that is high resolution, so I end up using that one a lot.
This is sort of a related question, Marie. Alex asks, how did your own religious views have an effect on your book, American Harvest, and your experience on the road with Christian farmers?
My own religious views, I really tried to take my own religious views out of the experience. I don't really have hardened religious views. So my stance that I tried to take was one of being open. I was very conscious of the fact that I was in someone else's world, in their culture, and I felt like my job was to try to understand what I was seeing. It was not really for me to apply my values onto others. It was to say, what is the nature of what I'm seeing? What am I really seeing? And that's why in the beginning of the book, we go to church, and I have absolutely no idea what the pastor's talking about. I can't even understand the conversation because it's almost like it's in another language. And I need Justin's help to understand what's happening. So I was also, and I say this in the book, I was conscious of what, people like me, like a liberal coastal person, says and thinks about people who go to church every Sunday. And so I would go to church and I would think, I know that this is what my friends at home think of me doing this. And I have to leave that behind and go and just have this experience with people for whom this is meaningful. And it's so interesting. I just did this book group with a bunch of people who live in San Francisco. And they said to me, well, why did you even bother looking at faith? And I said, oh, right, because of course, my education was that faith is personal, and we leave faith out of conversations. You just don't talk about politics or religion. And I said, but with this group of people I was traveling with, that's impossible. It'd be like amputating. Like, we're going to talk about your entire body, but not your arms. I had to talk about their faith. It just, they weren't going to be represented fully as people in the way that they experience the world. So I understood that. But that's not really me imposing or not imposing my religious views on a situation, because I just personally don't have like such calcified ideas that it would make it impossible for me to go to church. And I still have friends who say, how could you do that?
Okay, we have a question from Benny, who also thanks you very much for sharing all the photos and details. And she says, beautiful reading. Her question is, have these immersive experiences changed your preference for writing fiction versus nonfiction?
Oh, what an interesting question. I thought that I was not going to write nonfiction next, but I actually have started another nonfiction project. But I also, most people don't know this, I've also got a novel underway. I think that the more you write, the more you write, which is what's happened to me. I will say there was a good decade where I did not, for whatever reason, read as much fiction or feel as enriched by it. And then recently I've become open to it again. I don't know why, actually. So I really think I'm probably just going to try to write both. And I do feel like we need good stories that are rooted in fiction that, inspire the imagination, because we have quite a few challenges in the world. And there is something that fiction can do to inspire us or make us dream that nonfiction can't.
Thank you for that, for your thoughts on that. I've got a question from Hannah. Could you please share one of the key reasons for you to focus on the farming community based in America when, for example, in Japan, there's a farm-based community and history which has not been widely dealt with in nonfiction?
So part of that is just practical, in that I had access to a harvest crew on a farm in the United States, and had done some writing, and a publisher said, yes, we'll work with you on this project. And I also, I am married and have a child. And so for the previous book, which was set in Japan, I won a grant, I got a special visa. I could take my son, who was really young, with me to Japan and travel around and learn a whole new set of vocabulary, Buddhist vocabulary, to write Where the Dead Pause. And I thought, when that project was, and it was so hard, I thought, okay, well, this next book, I just want to deal with English, because it was incredibly draining and taxing to constantly learn new vocabulary in Japanese to write Where the Dead Pause and the Japanese Say Goodbye. Although, I ended up feeling like I had to learn a whole new set of vocabulary in order to understand evangelical Christian America. So I was also drained by that experience. But it's interesting you asked the question, because I have some writing that hasn't really been published. I spent some time on the island of Shikoku in Japan, which I love, and which in some ways feels like the Japan of 30 years ago, and is also where, I forget the gentleman's name, but he's one of the first kind of popularizers of organic farming that we know of in California. And I was tracing how he brought his ideas to the United States. And I thought, wow, I would love to write about that. But it's challenging. It just because I want to write about something doesn't mean that I can get a project greenlit, to use like a movie term. But it's so interesting you asked that, because I have thought about writing about that, but it would require support for the project, more money, and so I'd have to find ways to make that happen practically.
All right, I have one last very quick question from Charles, and he wants to know, were all the employees in the farming story you wrote about, were they all employees of faith, and was there room for non-believers? And he also says he values your non-judgmental approach.
Yeah, everybody's a Christian, and pretty much everybody I met was a Christian. It was the here I am in California. It was the quote unquote other America, where everybody was de facto a person of faith. Everybody had grown up going to church. Everyone knew the worship songs. And a friend of mine came to visit frequently. She was a photographer. We grew up together. She was half Syrian and half white. She would always say to me, I can't believe how nice everybody is. I thought Christians were really mean. That's what she would say. And, the people I was traveling with were so gentle and well-mannered, not proselytizers, not trying to convert me. They would answer my questions. They got some of them got a little tired of my questions. But this was not like a hellfire and brimstone type situation. And so there was plenty of room, for people to be questioning. This is the thing, if you go and have actual experiences, you will find stories that aren't necessarily reported in the mainstream media. There's always like the story that you're supposed to say. There's always the thing you're supposed to think. And this is true of Japan too, right? There's the thing you're supposed to think about Japan. Japan is quirky. Everybody likes robots. I mean, they're like the standard answers that people think that they have for a given situation. And I think this is one of the things about being a writer, is you can go and learn, wait, what is actually the story? What do the humans actually have to say? And
Right.
so,
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marie. We've come to the end of a wonderful program. And as Marie said earlier, write more in order to write more, right?
yes.
And right. So we hope you will lit fest more with us and come back for our next event at 4 o'clock, featuring Nishat Ahmed and Joanna Eleftheriou. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you so much. It was my great pleasure. Thank you, everybody.